If you ask me who was the most perfect European that I have ever met, I will tell you that his name was Stefan Zweig. You may have read something, a novel or biography of this great writer. You may have read perhaps one of his lovely essays. You may have read him in translation or in the original German. But if you have not taken the trouble to know what sort of man Stefan Zweig was, you have missed something extraordinary in the realm of European literature. Now, I said that he was the most perfect European. What do I mean by that? You see, the word European has come to mean all sorts of things in our days. It has come to mean seat of trouble, turbulent countries, countries that are almost in a continuous war with each other, and the great name of European has completely been lost. Now, let me remind you, my dear listeners, that the word great European was bestowed on very few people. I believe that the great Frenchman, Voltaire, prided himself that he was, and he was known as, the great European. There was another man, Goethe, who was known as the great European. And there was a great Jewish poet, Heinrich Heine, who his greatest title, he always assured the world, is to be a good European. And so there have been a few of the greatest spirits, the finest thinkers, those men, universal men, who did not belong to one country alone, but who spoke for the whole of Europe, and that is for the best of Europe, for that civilization, that Jewish Christian civilization that was the making of the European culture and civilization. Stefan Zweig was such a man. He was born in Austria. He was born in a society that was assimilated. He was of that type of Jewish family that knew very little about the particular Jewish tradition, but he always felt himself a proud Jew. Though he did not ascribe to any doctrine of Jewish life, nevertheless, he felt, like many another, of that Viennese Jew, that is the highly civilized and the highly cultured. He felt that to be a Jew is something very noble, but it is not the only thing to be in life. One must belong to the whole of the human family, to the whole of the human race. Now, Stefan Zweig began as a writer, or I should rather say a poet, in Vienna, having been given the best education, but when he studied at the universities of Vienna, of Berlin, he did, as he admits himself, very little studying, but more thinking, writing, enjoying the finer things of life, poetry, music, painting, architecture. Now, these were the finer things in life, and remember that the 90s of the last century was not only the gay 90s as it is sometimes known, but it was also the spiritual revival in Europe of a certain international tone in the circles of the best European writers. And our friend Stefan Zweig belonged to that group, to the group of Arthur Schnitzler, to the group of Hugo von Hofmannsthal, to the group later, the younger Werfel, and the men who formed, like Karl Kraus, who formed the avant-garde of the Austrian branch of literature. I say Austrian branch because although they wrote in German, they nevertheless never considered themselves German. In that sense, they were the gay Austrian family that naturally used the German language, but with a peculiar Viennese charm and wit and gaiety. Now, Stefan Zweig started as such a writer. Here, I would like to tell you a rather interesting little story that Stefan Zweig told me. You see, I was fortunate enough to know him rather intimately in the last few years of his life, particularly during his exile years in London. Stefan Zweig started his career with having one of his editors, one of his first editors, a man who impressed the Jewish world with something rather grand. Now, when he was very young, about 18 years old, Stefan Zweig sent in a little feuilleton, that is, a little short essay, as it was called in Vienna, just as well as in Paris, the feuilleton, and he sent it in to the Neue Freie Presse in Vienna. And the editor was a remarkable man, a very gifted writer, a poet himself, and one of the most handsome men in Vienna. This was the editor of the Neue Freie Presse, particularly the literary editor, the feuilleton editor. And Stefan Zweig sent in one of his, he was an unknown man, he sent in one of his little essays to this editor. After reading it, the editor wrote a short note to the young writer and invited him to come to his newspaper office. Zweig went, and from that day on, a great friendship ensued between those two people. If I were to tell you the name of this editor, you would rather be surprised, because he was no other than Theodor Herzl, you know, the founder of political Zionism, the man who made possible the independence, or the first idea of an independent state in Palestine. Theodor Herzl was then the editor of the Neue Freie Presse. And here are a few words that Stefan Zweig writes also in his autobiography. The feuilleton editor of the Neue Freie Presse invited me to come to him. At that time, his stand was still divided and uncertain. He began as a young poet and soon gave evidence of startling, astounding journalistic talent. At first, he was the correspondent and later the feuilletonist of the Neue Freie Presse, and as such had become the darling of Vienna public. His essays are still enchanting in their wealth of sharp and oftentimes wise observations, their stylistic animation, and their aristocratic charm. Whether light or critical, they never lost their innate nobility. They were the most cultivated in journalism and were the delight of a city that had schooled itself to every subtlety. Herzl had been successful with a play given at the Burg Theater, and now he was a man of fame, adored by the young, respected by our fathers, till one day the unexpected happened. Destiny always knows how to find a way to a man whom it needs for its secret purposes, even if he desires to hide himself. Now, you remember when I spoke to you last week about Leon Blum, I told you that it was Leon Blum who became, so to speak, a Jew during the Dreyfus affair. Now, this same thing, if you remember, also happened to Theodor Herzl in Paris. And Stefan Zweig, this poet who started out as a European, that is, he saw no boundaries between culture. He felt himself at home in Paris as well as in London, in Berlin as well as in Rome, in New York as well as in Buenos Aires. This man, Stefan Zweig, also became a Jew during the Dreyfus case. It was the usual thing then for the intellectuals of Europe. It's those Jews who were completely assimilated, that they were awakened to some consciousness of being a Jew in that perfect European culture. And it seems It seemed to them that somehow one must do something in order that the Jewish culture and the Jewish civilization should not be just, as Heine once said, a misfortune, but should be worn with pride. It should be worn with that feeling of noblesse oblige. And so, Stefan Zweig tells us how in Paris, Theodor Herzl had an experience which convulsed his soul, one of those hours that change an entire existence. As a newspaper correspondent, he witnessed the public degradation of Alfred Dreyfus, saw them tear the epaulettes from the pallid man while he cried aloud, "I am innocent." At that moment, he knew in his depth that Dreyfus was innocent and that he had brought the horrible suspicion of treason on himself merely by being a Jew. Indeed, in his upright and manly pride, Theodor Herzl had already suffered the Jewish stigma when he was a student. Moreover, by his prophetic instinct, he had foreseen the entire tragedy of his race at a time when it had not appeared to be an inevitable fate, with a feeling of being born to leadership, which his imposing presence, no less than his grandiose thinking and his worldly knowledge seemed to confirm. He had then formulated the fantastic plan to end the Jewish problem once and for all. Jewry was to unite itself with Christianity by means of conversion. Always thinking that was the first idea that Herzl had. It is curious that he was never ashamed of it, and you can always read about it in Herzl's diaries. Herzl, always thinking dramatically, he had pictured to himself how he would lead the thousands and thousands of Jews of Austria and the rest of Europe. Soon he realized the unfeasibility of this plan, and years of his own work diverted him from the original plan of his life, the solution of which he had recognized as his true task. But now, at a moment of Dreyfus' degradation, the thought of the eternal exile of his people entered his breast like the thrust of a dagger. If separation was inevitable, he said to himself, then let it be a complete. If humiliation is to be our constant fate, then let us face it with pride. If we suffer because of our homelessness, then let us build our own homeland. And so he published his pamphlet, The Jewish State. Now, Stefan Zweig was the first man to admire this little fantastic book by Theodor Herzl, The Jewish State. And if you remember that when Herzl published his little book and sent it to one of the well-known Austrian Jewish rabbis, he told him, you know, my dear Herzl, I would advise you that you should send your book to a psychiatrist, because there is definitely something wrong with you, that you should have such a nightmare in an enlightened Vienna. I would advise you that you should send your little book to the great psychiatrist, Dr. Max Nordau. Perhaps he might help you. And, you know, Herzl was, in some ways, though he was a great dreamer, he was a very naive man also. And Herzl did actually send a copy of his book to Max Nordau. Max Nordau read the little book and invited Herzl to come to him. And he said, my dear young man, Nordau was a little bit older. My dear young man, he said, if there is something wrong with your brain, I would like to share it, because I feel that your ideas in this little book, The Jewish State, are feasible, and I will help you to make this ideal a reality. But Zweig, a little bit further from the world of politics or of political action, tried to do something else in the world. What he tried to do in Europe was to combine European literatures, European cultures, and exchange thought, exchange translations, come to Paris and translate German poets, and in Germany to translate French poets, and so in Belgium, and so in Italy, and so in England. Show the people, that was his great dream, that there is one common tradition in European literature, and if we shall not achieve that, and remember that was the years before the First World War, then Stefan Zweig said and thought and wrote to many of his great friends that European civilization must decline, and that will be probably one of the gravest and darkest periods that the world will go through. Because after all, that European little continent is the mother of our European culture, or Western culture, which also includes, of course, America. And Zweig worked for that purpose. He went to Belgium, where he met the great French, Franco-Belgian poet Verhaeren. He stayed with him. He translated his book of verse into German. It was a great success. He made friends with a great French poet Valéry, with André Gide, and with Anatole France. And Zweig himself, being from a well-to-do home and having such a phenomenal success as a very young writer, became one of the, I should say, wealthiest European writers at that period. He traveled a lot, he lectured, he read, but with all that, Stefan Zweig was one of the shyest men that you could ever meet. He was so shy that he told me once that he would rather travel without any evening dress in order not to have to go to some of the official functions where you have to meet all sorts of people and say such polite platitudes which really mean nothing, and they are a waste of time, and they're only for the snobs. I remember that Zweig rarely stayed in London without having to hide himself, because he disliked going to these official, literary receptions of the Fen Club, of all those other tea parties and cocktail parties and what have you. Zweig's great struggle was for the intellectual brotherhood of men. And there was hardly a European intellectual. If it was H.G. Wells or George Bernard Shaw or Anatole France or the great Benedetto Croce in Italy, all these were his friends. All these looked upon Zweig as the perfect European, the men who combined the culture with polite civilization. Actually, Zweig was a sort of man of the Renaissance, a man who did not belong in a mechanical age. You could see it even in his bearing, in the personal contact with him. It was something so delightful and so fine in him, his exquisite way of talking, his tremendous politeness, and his interest. It did not matter if you were the most important person in the world or really a waiter. He would take interest in your personal affairs. He would ask you delicately, of course, very delicately, about your personal life and how you manage it. Of course, there was no one else that I have known in my life who was so ready to help you materially, not only just with advice and with a nice smile and a pat on the back, no, literally to help you. You see, he did help so many people, and I am myself a witness of those hundreds of writers, of artists, of painters, of musicians, who had a great struggle in the world, and Stefan Zweig would come to them. He would beg them to accept anything from him, money or sometimes a stipend, or sometimes he would ask them to do something for him. This was the best excuse that he always used to have, because he was afraid that he might offend somebody's finer feelings. So he would ask him, please do for me such and such reading, or do for me such and such research work. and he would pay you for it. He would pay 10 times as much as he would have been able to get this from an ordinary research student in any of the libraries of Europe, or from the best of secretaries. But Stefan Zweig insisted that something should be given to him in exchange. And so you see, my dear friends, in Stefan Zweig we have left one of the great men in Europe. I said we have left him there because although Stefan Zweig did not die in Europe, but he went away from Europe into Brazil, and there he ended his life with his own hands. Nevertheless, remember that this was 8 years ago, in 1942, and Stefan Zweig was then at the age of 60, and it was to him a great moral protest, the only thing that he could do then. The world of Europe was to him lost. There was no ray of hope, and to live, though he could afford to have lived in the greatest luxury. And I know that although the Germans have taken away everything that he had in Germany, some of the greatest libraries, some of the finest houses, and his collection of the most beautiful books and of the most exquisite manuscripts and furniture of rare quality. I mean, he had a chair that belonged to Beethoven, a table that belonged to Mozart, a pen that I have seen myself with which Goethe used to write. All these treasures that he collected all his life was taken away from him. But what the Germans could not take away was his fame. All those millions of readers in every civilized country outside Germany in the world, even I say under Mussolini, he was the most popular writer in Italy. And he was translated in 24 languages, at least 24 that I have seen myself in his own library. You see, he left all that, and Germany could not take this away from him. Nevertheless, as a moral protest, he decided to go away. And with him went his devoted wife. I knew them very well. And I could tell you that I still today speak with great trembling when I think of their death, because it was the darkest hour to us all in Europe. Zweig felt that to die when you are ill or when you are absolutely in material need and when you are a beggar, that is cowardly. But to die as a moral protest to the world or what they have done to the great intellectual spirit of the European tradition, that was something noble. And therefore, when I remember his life, when I remember his works that he left with us, I think of him as a rare man, a man that one could love and admire at the same time. Such men one never forgets. On such men, the great hope of the world still rests. Good afternoon.